That summer, the air over St. Enoch felt heavier than it should have. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move, carrying the dry scent of wheat and dust instead of the usual songs of sparrows. The town had always marked its weeks by the sound of the church bell, its familiar toll marking births, deaths, and every Sunday service since the settlement's founding. But on the morning of August 16, 1874, the bell's rhythm was wrong. It rang 13 times, each peal drawn out longer than the last, the sound bending in a way that made listeners uneasy. People in the street stopped mid-step, some staring toward the white spire as if counting on their fingers, certain they had misheard. No one had ever heard 13 before. In the homes along the main road, women at their stoves froze with spoons hovering over pots, and children fell silent without knowing why. The air seemed to press in, a strange stillness settling over the fields and stables, as if the ringing had somehow drained motion from the world. By noon, the townsfolk who had not gone to church began to notice something else. The wagons and horses tied outside St. Enoch's small clapboard church still stood as they had at dawn, but no one came out to tend them. The windows, which always sat cracked open to release the heat, were shut tight. The front doors stood closed. There was no muffled sound of hymns leaking into the street, no shuffle of feet, no echo of the Reverend's low, steady voice. It was as though the building had swallowed its congregation whole. By mid-afternoon, when the sun turned white above the dry earth, curiosity began to turn to unease. Farmers walking past on their way to the grain mill paused at the sight of untouched lunch baskets left on wagon seats, cloth napkins neatly folded, bread still warm. The horses swayed gently where they stood tethered, flicking their tails against flies, their reins slack as though they had been waiting all day. When one man knocked at the church doors, the sound was too loud in the quiet, the wood answering with a hollow echo that carried strangely far. There was no reply from within. Toward evening, as the sky bruised with streaks of purple and gold, a small group of townsfolk gathered at the steps, whispering their theories in voices that trembled. Some insisted the congregation must have left through the back and gone into the fields, though no one could explain why. Others claimed to have heard a low sound from inside earlier. Not voices, but something that felt like a vibration in the bones, a note too deep to belong to any organ or human throat. They hesitated to go in. It was not fear of what they might find, but the sharper dread of disturbing something still happening. Finally, as the last light began to drain from the prairie, a handful of men pushed the doors inward. The air that spilled out was cool, too cool for the season, carrying the faint scent of wax and something sharper beneath it, like iron left in the rain. The pews sat in perfect rows, unoccupied. The hymnals lay open on their ledges, pages still as if no hands had ever turned them. Candles burned low at the altar, their flames barely moving. There was no overturned bench, no dropped prayer book, no trace of struggle. It was not abandonment. It was erased. The men searched the side rooms, the choir loft, even the storage under the pulpit. Every space was empty. What unnerved them most was not the absence of people, but the feeling that the room had been recently full, as though the warmth of bodies still lingered in the air just beyond reach. The air seemed to hum faintly in their ears, though no one else spoke of it aloud. By the time they stepped back outside, night had come, and the rest of the town was waiting in the dark. The doors were closed again without anyone deciding to close them. The horses remained tethered until morning, when they were finally led away, their owners nowhere to be found. No footprints led from the church, no wagon track showed departure. It was as though the congregation had been unmade. The following Sunday the bell did not ring. After that it remained silent again. Before long the sound of church bells was forgotten in St. Enoch, as though it had belonged to another lifetime. The absence of hymns became part of the air, a constant low throb in the life of the town. People stopped speaking of that day, though they never stopped counting in their heads whenever a clock chimed, waiting to hear if 13 would come again. They would glance toward the white spire and look quickly away, as if afraid the building might be looking back. No one could explain what had happened that August morning, but everyone agreed on one thing. The day the bell tolled 13, St. Enoch became a town without Sundays. Reverend Aldous Brain had arrived in St. Enoch 10 years before the disappearance, stepping off the stagecoach with a single leather suitcase and a book of psalms worn thin at the spine. In those first years he won the trust of every household with his patience, his way of listening without judgment, and the quiet cadence of his voice. His sermons never thundered like the traveling preachers who passed through. Instead, they unfolded slowly, as if he were drawing something delicate from the air. He always ended them the same way, with a long, measured pause and then a smile that seemed to linger just a breath too long. At first, that smile felt like a kindness. Over time, it began to feel like something else. He was meticulous in all things. His collar was always straight, his shoes polished even when the streets were thick with mud. The hymns he chose followed peculiar sequences, often repeating verses in patterns that only he seemed to understand. Parishioners said he could recall the exact wording of a conversation years after it had happened, as if he kept a precise ledger in his mind. He spent hours alone in the sanctuary after services, arranging hymnals in perfect symmetry, adjusting the position of the candles by fractions of an inch. Some saw this as devotion, others whispered that it was compulsion. In the months before the vanishing, his smile began to change. It held longer, stretching into silences where people expected words to follow. It was as though he was listening to something they could not hear, his gaze fixed not on their faces but somewhere just past them. Those who noticed often felt an unease they couldn't name, a quiet pull to look away before he was finished. When he spoke of faith, his language shifted from salvation to permanence. He preached about the architecture of the soul, about the need to keep one's spiritual form unbroken, as if the human essence could be shaped like timber and preserved like stone. Weeks later, letters were found in his study, most written to himself in a looping, careful hand. They were not confessions or drafts of sermons, but meditations on a singular idea: that the soul, like a building, could be made strong enough to survive without its body. He described it as preserving the soul through structure, a process he believed could be perfected with the right conditions. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, more like a blueprint than a prayer. One passage noted the importance of alignment, not moral alignment, but the alignment of the human form within a space measured to exact proportions. In conversation, Brain began asking strange questions. How often someone dreamed, whether they remembered the shape of the church ceiling when their eyes were closed, if they ever felt their heartbeat match the rhythm of the bell. He spoke of rest not as an end, but as a crossing. More than one person left the sanctuary uneasy, uncertain why his voice had left them with the image of a locked door. And yet no one suspected danger. His kindness never wavered. He visited the sick, brought bread to widows, blessed newborns with the same gentle touch he had shown for years. But in those who met his eyes there was a sense that he was seeing past skin and bone into something fixed and still, as if the living part of them was already on a table in his mind, ready to be measured and set. When the day came that the church bell tolled 13, the memory of that lingering smile returned to many. It was not the warmth of a shepherd tending his flock, but the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who knows his work is finally complete. The sanctuary was not large, yet it carried a gravity that outgrew its boards, a pull once called holiness and later named weight. After the disappearance, men with tapes and carpenters' squares moved through the nave in patient lines, measuring the room the way a doctor measures a body after death. They found the center aisle at exactly 52 feet, the span between facing pews precisely 21, the ridge beam rising to a height that was a clean multiple of 7. Angles met at true right, but the plan was not a simple rectangle. Slight convergences drew every eye toward a point above the altar. Pencil guides hid beneath the whitewash, tiny crosses at regular intervals, a drafter's ghost map across the surface. In the choir loft, a sunk pendulum kept time with the building itself. The pews sat on shallow wedges that tipped a seated spine toward the center line. Under every pew, copper nails were set at identical distances. Compasses twitched along the middle of the room. Felt under baseboards killed certain notes, while narrow vents pushed air toward the chancel and met at a standing point where breath felt heavier. The glass panes were strict colors. At noon, their bands fell in measured bars that matched faint chalk lines now wiped away. Beneath a floorboard lay a folded grid that scaled in 3s, 5s, 8s, and 13s, with notes about resonance and obedience. Brain's hand named the building an instrument. A cupboard held chords cut to fixed lengths and tagged with parishioner names. Stretched end to end, they matched paths from threshold to pew. Initials were scraped on the undersides of seats, each beside a notch whose spacing matched those chords. Near the rail, pale ovals marred the floorboards, made by a hot ring pressed and lifted. During prayer, feet filled them without trying. In the crawl space, glass jars nested in sawdust held a pebble, a lock of hair, a clean sliver of bone. The rows mirrored the seating above, 13 repeating like a drumbeat. A neat note called them anchors and claimed an anchor kept a self from dispersal, collecting the trace of a body shed when it waited, sang, or knelt. Organ pipes were filled by a blade so fine the cuts looked like light. A tuner's fork lay wrapped in cloth, etched with a frequency and the word abide. At the nave's midpoint, a hum made teeth tremble. A step backward erased it, a step forward returned it, nodes and hollows pinned to the floor like an unseen grid. The candle holders sat on hidden pins that returned them to the same coordinates after dusting. A ledger set distances like prayers, lintel to font 9, font to rail 13, rail to threshold 21. Faint chalk arcs on the west wall rose to shoulder height, the path of a string swung from a pin. At their tips, the plaster felt cool even on hot days. A boy remembered Brain asking the congregation to hold one pure note after a hymn until the room seemed to carry it for them. When he stopped, he felt himself still singing somewhere outside his body. That, Brain wrote in papers later found, was the point. Loosen the person's edge, tighten the room's edge, let the stronger shape win. Once the shape held, he hinted a door could be opened without wood moving. Outside, wind lived by weather. Inside, air traveled in obedient lanes and set a faint current at ear level, steady as a whisper. Light was trained too. A nail hole near the steeple threw a narrow beam that crawled along the nave and fixed on the pulpit as evening service would have ended. The men stood in that line of light and understood only that someone had drawn their world into measures and stapled the measures to faith. They could not shake the sense that when the bell tolled 13, the building finished a long rehearsal and played a single intended note. The room was not shelter, but mold, an instrument, pressing living people into a pattern until they matched it more exactly than themselves. When the last tape was rolled and the last mark copied, the sanctuary looked harmless again. Bare pews, clean floor, a window catching sky. But the numbers remained like fingerprints underwater. They wrote them into their report with tired hands and without meaning to began to count their own steps as they left. Feeling the pattern tried to keep them. They did not predict what the fields would give back when the earth, tuned by the same hand, decided to speak next. 6 weeks had passed since the 13 tolls, long enough for the shock in St. Enoch to settle into something heavier. People worked their fields, but with glances toward the church they could not help. Children were told not to play within sight of its steeple. Then one gray morning a wheat farmer named Elias Markham took his hound to the far edge of his land, where the soil dipped into a shallow swale. The dog's bark turned sharp, frantic the way it did for a trapped animal. When Elias followed, he found the earth disturbed, wheat bent low, soil loosened. The dog had dug to a pale curve that looked at first like stone, but it was smooth skin stretched too tight across a cheekbone. The smell came next, not the rot of something freshly dead, but the sour, flat air of something sealed too long and let out. The body was a woman, though the skin had the waxen tone of candle drippings. Her dress was intact but stiff, as if it had been soaked in something that leached its color to a dull gray. Her hands were folded neatly on her chest, nails scrubbed and clean. The most arresting thing was her face, the eyes sewn wide with black thread, each stitch pulled through with perfect, even spacing. The thread was coarse, fibrous, and when the coroner later teased a strand apart, it revealed itself as twisted human hair. Beneath the eyelids, the eyes were clouded, but the stitching gave her a look of unnatural alertness, as if she had been made to keep watch even in death. When the coroner opened her mouth expecting soil, he found instead a small, polished pebble, smooth as if worn in water. Its surface had been etched with a single number. 1. The number was not carved crudely, but engraved with precision, each line deep and clean. The stone fit perfectly between her tongue and the roof of her mouth, held there by the natural closing of her jaw. No one recognized the woman at first. Her hair had been cropped close to the scalp, leaving an uneven shadow. But measurements, of her hands, and the faint outline of a wedding ring she no longer wore matched her to Lydia Frost, a farmer's wife and member of Brain's congregation. There were no injuries to explain her death. The heart had simply stopped, as if on command. There was no sign she had fought against what was done to her eyes or the placement of the stone. This absence disturbed the townsfolk more than any wound could have. It suggested agreement, or a state in which agreement could be taken without protest. Sheriff Harrow ordered the field dug in a widening ring, expecting more graves, but the earth yielded nothing else. That night, under the oil lamp in his office, he studied the pebble again. The number 1 seemed less like a marking for identification and more like an order of events, a first act in something that would continue. He could not stop his mind from moving to the fact that Brain's ledger, found weeks earlier, bore numbers beside names, not as dates or ages but as a sequence. Lydia Frost had been first. Word spread fast. Farmers refused to work alone in the outer fields, and at night the town's lamps burned later. Some began sleeping in their clothes. Others sharpened tools they had never used as weapons. But beneath all of it was the unspoken certainty that Lydia's grave was not singular, only the first to be found. Somewhere the others waited, and whatever order Brain had written into his book was still unfolding beneath the soil. The fields around St. Enoch took on a strange stillness in the following days, as if the wheat leaned subtly toward places no one wanted to dig. Every step past the fence line made the air feel thicker, carrying a faint tang of metal in the throat. The searchers kept their eyes low, unwilling to look toward the spire in the distance. It stood too white against the sky, a mark of something finished but not ended. By the week's close, the town understood they would not need to find the other bodies. The land would give them back when it was ready in its own deliberate order. Lydia Frost was only the beginning, the one of a sequence no one dared to count aloud. The ledger was found in the locked lower drawer of Reverend Brain's writing desk, the key left in plain sight on the sill as if he had wanted someone to open it once he was gone. Its leather cover was worn to softness, the edges dark with the oil of years of hands. The paper inside had yellowed unevenly, as if some pages had been exposed to heat while others had been shielded. What first drew the eye was the smell. Not the must of an old book, but a faint tang of tallow mixed with the dry, sour edge of ash. The scent clung to the fingers of anyone who touched it, stubborn and unpleasant, as if the book itself were steeped in residue from something burned that had not been meant for a fire. The entries were arranged in precise columns, each headed by a name from Brain's congregation. These were not written in the quick hand of weekly notes. The letters were deliberate, each stroke identical in weight, the ink evenly dark as though none of it had faded in the years the book had been kept. Beside each name was not the expected check mark or date of attendance, but a diagonal slash. The slashes were grouped in sets of 13 before starting again, the lines so clean and sharp they looked carved rather than written. On closer inspection they were carved. A thin blade or metal point had cut through the paper just enough to leave a raised burr at the back. The marks had gone so deep that many slices tore faint white scars in the page beneath. At the far edge of every line, past the slashes, was a number. This was not ink, but an indentation so forceful it sank into the sheet, visible in reverse on the other side. The numbers were sequential, starting from 1 and continuing without gap. Lydia Frost's name bore the number 1, just as the pebble in her mouth had declared. Whoever followed her in Brain's list had been marked as 2, 3, 4, and so on. The highest number visible before the last entry was 59. That there had been fewer than 60 names in the congregation meant one of two things. Either some had been given more than one number, or Brain's count did not align with the living at all. Between some names, faint brown smudges discolored the page, darker at the edges where the fibers had absorbed more. The stains were irregular, and the coroner later suggested they might be blood-wiped thin, though there was no way to be certain. What was certain was the pattern. Those whose numbers were divisible by 13, 13, 26, 39, 52, had a second mark beside their names. A small cross, drawn not with ink but pressed in with something hot enough to sear the paper without burning through. The back pages of the ledger held no names, only lists of numbers and distances, inches, feet, spans, written in the same hand. Next to some measurements were brief notes like true alignment, kept without warp, or final position. It was as though the congregation had been both charted and arranged according to rules no one else had been told. When the ledger was shown to the townsfolk, some claimed to remember Brain lingering at the door after services, speaking softly as his hand rested on a shoulder, his eyes somewhere lower, counting the breaths or the rhythm of a heartbeat. Others recalled how he sometimes paused mid-sermon to look at a particular pew, as if confirming something he had already written down. Sheriff Harrow tried to dismiss the book as eccentric bookkeeping until Lydia Frost's entry, number 1, forced him to see it for what it was, an order of disappearance. The ledger was not a record of the past, but a map of what was to come, each name waiting for its turn. That night, Harrow locked the ledger in the evidence chest, yet the smell of tallow and ash seemed to follow him home, clinging to his hands no matter how much he washed. In bed, he thought of those deep, perfect cuts through the paper and how they had been made with a hand steady enough to divide a town's life into measured steps toward an end only Brain had understood. In the weeks before the bell tolled 13, the rituals of St. Enoch began to change in ways that no one recognized as dangerous until it was too late. The shift was gradual, almost tender, the kind of adjustment that felt like devotion rather than departure. It began with the chalice. Brain had always served wine at communion, its taste modest and sweet, the kind bought in barrels from the nearest rail town. But that summer the wine turned darker, thick enough to cling to the silver rim, and the first sip left a faint bitterness beneath the tongue. He told the congregation it was a special vintage from far away, chosen for its purity. The purity, he said, was needed for the preservation of the soul. The change was not just in taste. The wine left a mark, a faint inky blue along the lips and gums, visible even hours later. Parishioners at first joked about it, laughing in the streets with mouths stained like ripe berries, but the color lingered for days, seeping into the creases of the tongue as if it were sinking deeper than surface flesh. Brain began serving at every service, not just at the monthly communion. His voice carried a new cadence when he raised the chalice, speaking the blessing not once but in a series of phrases that seemed rehearsed to match the timing of each swallow. Some claimed the wine made them feel lighter, almost untethered from their own weight. They described walking home afterward as though the ground had softened under their boots. Others spoke privately of sensations they could not name, a soft pulling inside the skull, the sense that their thoughts were floating in a larger room than the one they stood in. A few confessed in whispers that they could not recall the hours after leaving the church, as if something had quietly removed them from their own lives for a time. Witness accounts from those in neighboring towns describe other oddities. In late July, a merchant delivering goods to St. Enoch saw Brain leading a small group of parishioners into the sanctuary in the dead of night, each holding a single white cloth wrapped around their wrists. The merchant assumed it was some form of penance, but when he passed the church later, he heard a slow, unbroken hum rolling out into the dark, the sound so steady it seemed mechanical. Those inside emerged at dawn with the blue still vivid on their lips, their eyes glazed as though waking from a dream too deep to fully leave. By early August, the binding became more structured. Parishioners arrived early and sat in silence while Brain moved between them, wrapping their wrists in strips of damp cloth chilled to the point of discomfort. The cold whitened the skin and dulled the pulse beneath his fingers. He called this stilling the flow, a step, he told them, toward holding the soul in place. When the bindings were removed, some said they felt a rush, as if the world had tilted and their blood was trying to find its way back. Brain told them the rush was proof that the body could be interrupted without harm, and that each time it would grow easier until they would not feel it at all. He kept meticulous control of who received the chalice and when. Some were told to abstain for a week, only to be called to the altar alone on a quiet evening and given a deep draught in private. Others were served twice in the same day. Brain insisted these adjustments were to find the perfect measure for each soul. The congregation accepted his explanation without suspicion. He had, after all, been their spiritual guide for a decade, and the strangeness carried the weight of ritual, not abuse. After the disappearance, samples of the wine were tested in the nearest city. The liquid was found to contain not only fermented grapes, but an extract from a plant rare to the plains, a plant known in some old medical texts for its ability to slow the heartbeat and induce vivid, pliable states between waking and sleep. In small doses, it could make one feel detached, as if observing life from outside. In larger doses, it could suppress the will to move or speak entirely while leaving the mind aware. The most unsettling realization came from those who had refused the wine. A widow named Esther Cole claimed Brain's smile had tightened when she declined the chalice one evening, saying she had a sour stomach. After that, she found herself seated further back in the sanctuary, no longer in her usual place near the front. Her name in the ledger bore no number, only a cross. She left town 3 days before the bell tolled 13, and for years afterward she said she sometimes woke with the taste of bitterness on her tongue, though she had not touched wine since. What Brain called preservation was no metaphor. The blue that lingered on the lips was not a stain to be washed away. It was the visible mark of his work in progress, the sign of a body being shaped to hold still long enough for the soul to be taken from it intact. The grain mill on the south edge of St. Enoch had been abandoned long before the disappearance. its upper windows gaping and the wheels stilled by a decade of drought. Children had once dared each other to step inside its shadow, but by 1874 even those games had stopped. The building's sagging frame seemed to lean away from the road as if unwilling to be looked at. It was here, weeks after Lydia Frost's body was found, that investigators followed a trail of disturbed earth along the foundation and uncovered a narrow door half buried in silt. It opened to a stair that descended into cold. The first room they entered was nothing more than a storage chamber, the air heavy with the sweet rot of grain long since spoiled. But in the far corner, beneath a false floor, a second set of steps dropped farther still. These were cut from stone, worn smooth at the center as if under the tread of countless feet. The light of their lanterns caught a low ceiling supported by beams blackened not from fire but from oil rubbed into the wood until it gleamed like wet bone. The sub-basement was circular, the walls and floor fitted from the same gray stone, each block precisely cut to lock without mortar. Along the outer ring, the floor bore shallow grooves in perfect arcs, paths worn by bodies pacing in the same direction over and over. The width of the path suggested 13 could walk abreast, each step measured, the turn of each circle synchronized. There was no storage space. It was a chamber built for repetition, for movement that was both physical and ritual. At the center yawned a pit, its walls lined with polished wood so smooth it reflected the lamplight in soft, distorted bands. The opening was wide enough for 3 to stand side by side, and the descent was too deep for the light to touch the bottom. Dropping a stone brought no splash, only a distant muffled thud, as though it had struck cloth stretched taut over something that did not yield. The air here was wrong. Beneath the natural damp of an underground room was a sharp bite, a mingling of burnt cloves and the metallic tang of copper. The scent clung to the throat, leaving a faint bitterness at the back of the tongue. Against one wall stood a low table, its surface blackened in a ring the size of the pit's mouth. Lantern smoke revealed fine scratches etched into the stone around the table's legs. Concentric circles, 13 in all, the lines precise enough to have been measured with instruments. In the alcove behind the table, shelves held objects wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping them revealed lengths of white fabric stiffened with some resinous substance, lengths long enough to bind wrists and ankles many times over. Each was tagged with a small wooden marker bearing a number, the same hand that had pressed numbers into the ledger. There were no names here, only the sequence. Most unsettling of all was a narrow niche cut into the wall opposite the pit. Inside stood a row of shallow ceramic bowls, each containing a residue of dried liquid that, under the lamplight, shimmered faintly with a blue hue. The bowls were set at precise intervals, the space between them identical. One investigator noted that standing in front of the row produced an odd sensation in the ears, a low ringing that faded the moment he stepped back. It was in this room that the meaning of Brain's preparations began to form. The mill house had not been abandoned at all. It had been transformed into a hidden apparatus, a place where bodies could be placed into alignment, their movements made uniform, their senses dulled and tuned. The circles worn into the stone were evidence of conditioning, hours of walking in unison, binding mind and body to a rhythm dictated by someone else. The pit, Its polished lining catching every breath of light was the chamber's mouth, and whatever lay at the bottom was not meant to be seen. When they left, the investigators sealed the entrance, telling no one of what they had found. But those who descended into the sub-basement carried its scent with them for days, tasting cloves and copper in the air even as they ate, feeling the ground under their feet remember a circular path they had never walked. The pattern began months before the disappearance, though no one outside St. Enoch understood it until the pieces were laid together. It was not one ritual, but 13 distinct stages, each designed to strip away some part of a person's natural resistance. Brain had always spoken of discipline, but that summer his discipline became precision. The first preparation was fasting. Not the occasional abstention that farmers knew from lean harvests, but calculated hunger. He instructed the congregation to take only one meal a day, eaten after sunset, claiming that the soul should feed before the body. For most, it began as a test of devotion. Within weeks, it became a weakness that left their limbs heavy and their minds prone to drift. The second was silence. Brain began ending services with a long, unbroken pause, sometimes stretching nearly an hour, during which no one was allowed to speak or move. He called it the stilling, a time to let the self breathe out. This bled into the third stage, isolation. He encouraged members to withdraw from neighbors, to avoid idle talk, to keep the vessel clean of noise. By the fourth week, those who once lingered on porches to share news now went straight home, walking without meeting the eyes of those they passed. The fourth preparation was the most subtle: disorientation. Brain altered service times, ringing the bell at odd hours so the town's rhythm slipped. He scheduled gatherings in the deep hours before dawn, when the mind floats in the gap between sleep and waking. The fifth was repetition. Members were instructed to walk the perimeter of the churchyard exactly 13 times before entering, a practice that left them sweating and lightheaded even in cool air. The sixth stage was the binding. Strips of cloth kept in basins of chilled water in the sanctuary were wound tightly around the wrists and forearms until the skin blanched. The cold seeped into the veins, slowing the pulse while Brain moved among them, adjusting the bindings to some measure only he seemed to know. Some bindings were left for minutes, others for hours, the cloth replaced with fresh cold whenever it began to warm. He told them it was to still the river within, to make them steady for what was coming. By the seventh stage, the binding became paired with the chalice, the blue wine served not as communion but as medicine. Drunk on an empty stomach and under cold restraint, it left the body slack, the mind pliable. The eighth was deprivation of sleep. Brain kept the congregation in the sanctuary through the night, the candles burning low, the air thick with the scent of cloves. Those who nodded off were woken gently and told to hum a single tone, holding it as long as they could. The sound filled the room, vibrating through bone until it seemed to belong to the walls rather than the people making it. The ninth preparation introduced contact. Brain would place his palm on the forehead of each member and hold it there until they matched his breathing. Witnesses from neighboring towns claimed they saw St. Enoch's members walking in perfect unison, 13 abreast, eyes fixed ahead, their pace neither fast nor slow. Their expressions emptied of all but obedience, The 10th stage was denial of individuality. Brain stopped using names during gatherings, addressing the group as the vessel. Members were instructed to sit only where he placed them, to rise only when he gave a single nod. The 11th was mirroring. Hours spent repeating Brain's movements in exact detail, from folding cloth to tracing symbols on the floor. By the 12th stage, the congregation had ceased speaking to anyone outside their circle. Even children no longer played in the street. They sat on church steps in lines of 13, hands folded, watching the horizon. And the 13th, the final preparation, came on the last night before the bell tolled 13. Every member was bound at the wrists and ankles, seated in the sanctuary facing the altar. The blue wine passed from one to the next until each had drunk deeply. Brain walked the aisle slowly, his hand brushing each shoulder, his eyes lingering in silent confirmation. Those who saw it from outside said the candles flickered in perfect time with the breathing of the congregation, as if every chest rose and fell to one measured beat. When the sun rose the next morning, the town would find the doors closed, the horses tethered, and St. Enoch emptied of all but the hum still echoing in the air. The hidden door behind the pulpit looked like nothing more than a seam in the wainscoting, a line the eyes skipped over during prayer. But when the panel was pried free, it gave a faint sigh of cool air laced with cloves and something faintly metallic. The crawl beyond was narrow and low, sloping downward until knees ached, and it ended in a round chamber whose whitewashed walls gleamed dully in lamplight. Around the circumference, built with the precision of a jeweler's case, ran shallow shelves, and upon them lay teeth. Hundreds of them. They were arranged in 13 perfect rings that stepped inward like terraces toward a low pedestal at the center. Each tooth sat on a folded square of linen, and on each square a name was written in the same exact hand as Brain's ledger. The ink still dark, the lines unbroken. The teeth themselves were spotless, enamel polished to a soft luster that caught the light with a living gleam. Molars lay heavy at the outer rings, bicuspids and incisors leading toward the middle, and marking every 13th place was a milk tooth, pale and small, each tagged with a pressed number so deep it dented the wood beneath. At the center, under a glass dome, sat a single child's tooth threaded with a loop of fine gold wire and labeled not with a name but with one word: seed. There was no blood, no crude violence in this room. The cruelty was in its patience, the tenderness with which each relic had been taken and placed. Some roots showed the neat bevel of a blade, others the faint scorch of a heated loop that could part gum from bone without tearing. Beside the shelves lay a narrow tray of tools, delicate clamps, bone-handled scrapers, and coils of fine thread, each tagged with a length and a number, each clean to absence. A small book beneath the pedestal recorded not only the owner's name, but the date of removal, the time of day, the position they had sat in the sanctuary, and an unsettling final note, tuned or untuned. Brain's belief, written in a careful margin, was that enamel held the body's last perfect record of its life, a mineral archive of every prayer whispered through clenched teeth. Every meal broken, every moment of fear endured. He wrote that bone could decay and thought could fade, but a tooth would keep the self if placed among others according to its proper sequence. This chamber, then, was his second congregation, a choir of enamel arranged to remember what the living would forget. Those who stood there too long felt something in the air change, a pressure in the jaw, a faint urge to swallow, the strange conviction that the rings were listening. Sheriff Harrow, who found Lydia Frost's molar in the outer ring marked with her number 1, said later that the worst part was not the sheer number of teeth, nor the child's solitary seed, but the order, an order so complete it suggested the people of St. Enoch had been reduced in Brain's mind to pieces that could be moved, stored, and called upon at will. As the search party backed out, they did so slowly, not from superstition but from the sense that turning their backs on the rings might invite them to shift, closing in by the quiet increments of the patient dead. The morning of August 16, 1874, began without wind. The wheat in the field stood motionless, the stalks stiff as if carved from wax. Weather logs from the nearest rail town record the day as cloudless, the temperature rising faster than usual. Yet those in St. Enoch swore the air felt cool, almost damp, as though it had been drawn from somewhere underground. At precisely 9 o'clock, the church bell began to ring. Its sound carried farther than usual, and each toll seemed to stretch at the edges, hanging longer before the next. The town counted them as they came, 1, 2, up to 12. The 12th faded, and then came the 13th, lower, heavier, a vibration more than a tone. No one remembered a 13th before. By 10 o'clock, every member of the congregation was inside, the doors closed without a slam. The horses tied outside stood calm, their ears twitching toward the building. Meals sat cooling on kitchen tables, milk pails stood in barn aisles, the foam still trembling from the morning's work. Those who had stayed home began to notice the absence of hymns. On any other Sunday, the organ would have been heard by now, notes tumbling from the windows in broken lines. Instead, there was only a faint hum, too steady to be wind, that pressed faintly in the chest like the onset of fever. At noon, a witness passing the church swore they saw movement through the frosted glass of the side windows, rows of heads bowing and lifting in perfect unison, lips moving but no words forming. The hum was louder then, a single pitch held so long it began to blur at the edges until the ear could not tell if it was rising or falling. A torn hymn sheet later found in the street bore no music, only a single note printed 13 times in a column, and beneath it the word "hold." The hours slid past without change. The sun moved, shadows shifted across the white boards of the church. But the sound inside did not falter. By evening, those watching from a distance noticed the light through the high windows had taken on a strange quality. It was not dimmer, yet it felt diminished as though filtered through water. A few claimed they saw the air ripple above the steeple the way heat bends light over a stove. Just after sunset, the hum ceased. The sudden absence was a shock, like a breath held too long suddenly let go. For nearly a minute there was nothing, not even the scrape of a chair leg or the shuffle of feet. Then came a sound none could place. It was singing, but not hymns. It was a low braided chord, many voices merging into something that vibrated in the bones more than in the ears. Those standing near enough to hear said it made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. Yet they could not move away. The cord swelled, then cut off clean. A moment later, the candles in the windows went dark all at once. When a group of men finally pushed open the front doors, the sanctuary lay in perfect order. The pews were empty, hymnals open, candles burned down to their last inch. The air was unnaturally cool, and a faint mist clung low to the floorboards, curling around their boots. No footprints marred the dust in the aisles, though the candles' placement suggested they had been tended only moments before. The pulpit stood bare. The communion table was empty except for the chalice, still half filled with the blackened wine. It reflected the lamplight not in ripples but in small, perfect rings, as if something had vibrated it moments earlier. The bindings lay folded on the first pew, still damp and cold to the touch. They searched every corner, every storage room, the loft, even the crawl space beneath the floor, but the congregation was gone. There were no overturned benches, no scattered belongings, no signs of struggle. Yet in the stillness, each man swore they could hear a faint after-ring, the ghost of the chord, humming from the very bones of the building. It was not in the air but in themselves, a vibration they could feel in their teeth and skull. When they stepped back into the street, the night was unnaturally quiet. The horses still waited, heads low, eyes half-lidded as if dozing. Lamps glowed in distant houses, but no one came to the doors. The men shut the church doors behind them without speaking. In the weeks that followed, no one entered again without unease, knowing that on that Sunday the town had watched the living vanish not in chaos or violence, but in perfect, unbroken order. Each breath, each heartbeat tuned to a note that had led them somewhere no one else could follow. It was midwinter when the box arrived at the county courthouse, left on the clerk's desk during the noon hour when no one had been watching. There was no postmark, no address, no sign of how it had been delivered. The wood was dark and close-grained, its surface rubbed smooth, and the lid was secured not with nails but with small wooden dowels that slid free with a practiced twist. Inside lay a single leather-bound book and a strip of linen rolled tightly around an object no larger than a matchbox. Both smelled faintly of cloves and cold stone. The book was Brain's hand from first page to last, the same deliberate script that had filled the ledger. It was not a sermon collection, not even a diary. It was a manual. He called it his testament, though the word here meant not the recounting of belief but a set of instructions, as if his life had been lived only to prove the method he described. The first section spoke of the soul as a fixed structure, not an essence that drifted but a shape that could be held. Death, he wrote, fractured that shape. But if the soul could be removed whole before death and placed in a vessel of clean number, it could remain intact, awaiting reunion with a body made to its measure. In his view, the body was a temporary scaffolding, and the congregation of St. Enoch had been his material, each person shaped through the 13 preparations until they fit the pattern exactly. He wrote that the final Sunday had not been an ending but a crossing, that they had stepped through the line together, leaving their bodies behind in a form that did not decay but simply ceased to be visible. He claimed their souls were stored in the vessel, which the text described in precise geometric terms, rings, ratios, and frequencies matching the measurements of the sanctuary and the chamber beneath the mill. Midway through the book, his tone shifted from clinical to almost tender. He wrote of his parishioners by number, describing their temperaments not as personalities but as resonances. Lydia Frost, number 1, steady and cool, anchor of the first circle. Number 13, bright and volatile, fixed by proximity to the seed. Number 26, slight deviation in hum, corrected by double binding. His language made no distinction between their human lives and the qualities of objects in a machine. Toward the end, he addressed whoever found the testament. He claimed the process could be repeated anywhere if one could obtain a vessel of equal purity, and warned against misalignment, which would scatter the contents irretrievably. He did not plead for understanding or forgiveness. He stated only that his work was complete, and that they are kept, awaiting the time when the body could be remade to receive them. The small object wrapped in linen proved to be a tooth, a child's molar, threaded with gold wire identical to the one under the glass dome in the chamber of teeth. The wire was coiled into a loop that fit snugly around the top joint of a human finger, as though it had been worn like a ring. Scratched into the enamel in minuscule letters was the number 0. The sheriff, reading the testament by lamplight, understood then that Brain had counted himself outside the sequence, the 0 that stood before the first. Whether he had joined the others or remained behind was left unanswered, but the fact that the box had arrived without a witness suggested a hand still moving in the world. The book was locked in the courthouse vault, but its geometry, once read, was not easily forgotten. Those who handled it found themselves tapping the covers in patterns of 3s and 13s without meaning to, and one clerk swore she heard faintly a low note humming in the spine whenever the room fell silent. 7 years had passed since the disappearance, and the land around St. Enoch had grown wild. The wheat fields were patchy, the fences warped, and the road into town was more ruts than track. Most of the houses stood empty, doors sagging open to let the wind move through. The church still stood, though no one had touched its white boards since the day the doors were shut. People in the surrounding counties avoided the area entirely, choosing longer routes rather than pass within sight of the steeple. It was in the spring of 1881 that a traveling merchant named Robert Pell came through the northern plains on his way to Omaha. He took the St. Enoch Road without knowing its history and found himself camping a mile from the church. That night, as the fire dwindled to embers, he heard it, a thin ribbon of sound far off but too steady to be mistaken for wind. It was not a melody but a chord, as if many voices were holding the same note without breath or break. The sound rose and fell in slow, deliberate waves, each swell lasting so long that Pell swore it made his chest tighten. In the morning he followed the sound to its source. The closer he came to the church, the less it seemed to come from anyone direction. By the time he reached the front steps, the note was not heard so much as felt, a faint buzzing in the teeth, a heaviness in the bones. He peered through the windows and saw only dust and empty pews, but the sensation was stronger inside, as if the air itself were vibrating. When Pell told his story in Omaha, it reached a professor at the local college who had studied the effects of sound on structure. Intrigued, he convinced the county sheriff to allow an investigation. A team was sent with new instruments, tuning forks, barometers, wax cylinder phonographs, to measure the church's acoustics. They began by striking tuning forks in various places, noting how the sound carried. Near the center of the nave, a fork pitched at a low C set off a faint echo that did not match its tone, as if the building itself were responding in its own voice. When they recorded the interior on a fresh wax cylinder, the playback revealed something no one had heard during the session. Under the faint creak of the boards and the hiss of air was a constant hum. It was steady, unbroken, and layered. Not a single note, but many woven together so tightly they seemed to form a solid wall of sound. Counting the strands was impossible, but those who listened swore there were dozens, perhaps 100. The investigators checked every surface for hidden mechanisms, but the walls yielded nothing. The resonance was strongest behind the pulpit, near the seam that led to the hidden chamber of teeth. When they tested that space with the phonograph, the hum grew stronger, almost intolerable, and one of the cylinders cracked during playback as if the sound inside it had been too dense to hold. In the church's office, tucked between blank pages in a hymnal, they found a loose sheet that had once belonged to the ledger. The paper was brittle at the edges, but the ink was still dark. There was no list of names, no slashes or numbers. Only a short sentence written in Brain's exact hand. "We continue." Beneath it, pressed into the paper without ink, was a faint impression that matched the spacing of teeth. The team left St. Enoch unsettled. They could not prove the sound was supernatural, yet none could explain why it persisted without a source. The professor suggested it was the product of unique architecture, a resonance left over from years of repeated ritual. But one deputy who had been present during the disappearance and had returned for the investigation disagreed. He said the sound had not faded in 7 years. If anything, it had grown fuller, as though the choir were being joined by more voices over time. By the time they packed their instruments, the hum was so much a part of the space that they stopped noticing it until they stepped outside. Then, in the sudden absence, they felt its loss like the pulling away of a warm blanket. Several of the men remarked that the quiet seemed too sharp, that it made them uneasy to breathe air without that low vibration in it. The church doors were shut again when they left, though no one had touched them. And as they rode out along the road, one of the men looked back to see the faintest shimmer in the air above the steeple, a ripple that caught the morning light and bent it as if something vast but unseen were still moving inside. It was not one event that doomed the church, but years of uneasy watching, of whispered retellings in kitchens and across fence lines. The hum, the shimmer, the lingering sense that the air itself could be listening, all of it weighed on the neighboring towns until they acted. In the autumn of 1884, a small group of men from 3 counties came under cover of night, carrying oil and shovels. They did not enter the church. They circled it, pouring the oil thick along its baseboards, and lit it in silence. The flames took quickly, climbing the white boards with a hunger that seemed more like recognition than destruction. The spire fell inward, sending a brief gout of sparks into the sky before collapsing into the nave. They expected the fire to smell of pine and old varnish, but instead the smoke carried the sharp sting of cloves and a metallic tang that clung to the mouth. Some claimed they heard a sound beneath the roar, a long, low chord fading into the crackle, but others swore it was only the wind. By morning, nothing remained but a charred foundation, the outlines of the walls marked in black on the bare earth. The men shoveled soil over the site until it lay flat, and for a time it seemed the matter was closed. But the ground refused to heal. In the years that followed, nothing grew where the church had stood. Wheat sown there rotted in the stalk. Grass browned before it could spread. Livestock that wandered too near grew skittish, their ears flicking toward the center of the empty lot before bolting. In heavy rains, the foundation's lines reappeared as darker soil, as if the earth itself remembered the weight of the walls. The disappearance of St. Enoch's congregation became a caution passed quietly among rural pastors. Not a sermon topic, never written in scripture notes, but a thing to murmur when another preacher grew too proud of his authority. In 1892, the Nebraska legislature passed laws limiting solitary pastoral control, requiring a council to oversee financial and spiritual governance in any parish. The law was framed as a safeguard against administrative irregularities, but everyone knew its true origin. Families who had left the area rarely spoke of their ties to the town. When they did, they called it the place without Sundays, never by name. A few preserved odd relics, a scrap of hymn sheet, a small blue-stained cup, a piece of pew wood. But most destroyed anything connected to Brain, fearing it might still carry the shape of his work. Yet the story persisted. Traveling preachers spoke of it as a warning about obedience, how devotion could be sharpened into a blade without the flock realizing they were the ones on the altar. In the decades that followed, travelers still reported strange sensations passing near the lot where the church had stood. Some felt a pressure in the jaw, others a faint hum in the chest. The land remained empty, a square of barren soil amid the rolling wheat. On certain mornings, when the fog lay low, the outline of the foundation seemed to lift slightly, the air within it shivering as though from voices too far to hear. The story of St. Enoch forces an uncomfortable truth. Evil rarely arrives with a shout. It comes quietly with a steady hand and a patient smile, shaping the living until they fit its design. Brain did not take his congregation in a frenzy. He tuned them. He built a frame for their souls and walked them into it, step by deliberate step, until the day they vanished in perfect order. His work shows how darkness can hide behind the gentlest expressions, and how obedience, praised in the right light, can be the most dangerous tool of all. And so the land remains empty not because of superstition, but because it is a memorial in negative space, a reminder of what can grow when no one sees it growing. If the hum is still there, it is faint enough to hide beneath the sound of wind in the wheat, waiting for someone to pause long enough to notice. What do you think? Could this happen again?